Mr. Sherlock Holmes, who was usually late in the mornings, unless he had remained awake throughout the night, was seated at the breakfast table when I entered our sitting room in Baker Street. The pale winter light filtered through the window panes, settling gently upon his sharp features, and the clutter of papers spread before him. I had scarcely taken my seat when my attention was drawn to a curious object resting upon the table between us. It was a walking stick. Not an ordinary one, but heavy, thick at the head, and worn smooth by years of use. A broad silver band encircled it near the top, engraved with an inscription that had caught Holmes's eye as readily as it had mine. Holmes, without looking up, spoke at once. "Well, Watson," he said, "what do you make of it?" I picked up the stick and examined it carefully. It was solid and reassuring, the sort of implement carried by a country practitioner rather than a fashionable London gentleman. To James Mortimer, M.R.C.S., from his friends of the C.C.H., 1884, I read aloud. "It appears to be a presentation gift." "Quite so," Holmes replied. "But let us go a step further." I considered the object more closely. The owner is clearly a medical man. Rural practice, I would say. He walks a great deal. The stick is worn most noticeably on one side, suggesting a habitual right-handed use. Holmes smiled faintly. "An excellent beginning, Watson." He took the stick from me and held it lightly, as though weighing not its substance, but its story. "The man is also absent-minded," Holmes continued. "He has left this behind after a visit to us, and yet he made no attempt to recover it." "Then he has been here this morning?" I asked. "Precisely. He arrived during the brief interval when I stepped out, and departed before my return. A man with a pressing concern, yet one who hesitated to intrude too deeply." At that moment, the door opened, and Mrs. Hudson announced our visitor. Dr. James Mortimer entered the room with an air of quiet nervousness. He was a tall, thin man with a long nose and keen eyes behind round spectacles. His clothes bore the marks of country wear, and his manner suggested a man more accustomed to observing others than being observed himself. "I trust I am not late," he said. "On the contrary," Holmes replied, rising. "You are precisely on time. You left your stick behind." Dr. Mortimer flushed with embarrassment. "I feared as much. I hope to return quietly and retrieve it." Holmes gestured to a chair. "Pray sit down, doctor, and tell us what brings you to consult me." Mortimer hesitated, glancing once toward the window, as though gauging the privacy of the fog-shrouded street beyond. "I am here," he said at last, "because I am faced with a problem that defies ordinary explanation, a problem rooted in legend, yet with consequences that are painfully real." Holmes's eyes sharpened at once. "Legends," he said softly, "are often the shadows cast by forgotten truths. Proceed." Dr. Mortimer drew from his pocket a folded manuscript, yellowed with age. "This document," he said, "has been preserved by the Baskerville family for generations. It concerns a curse." Watson, that word alone was enough to stir unease within me. Though Holmes remained perfectly still, Dr. Mortimer began to read. The manuscript told of Hugo Baskerville, a reckless and cruel man who lived during the time of the Great Rebellion. It described his abduction of a young woman from the countryside, his imprisonment of her within Baskerville Hall, and her eventual escape across the bleak moorland. Enraged, Hugo had pursued her into the night, accompanied by his drunken companions. But upon the moor they found not the woman, but Hugo himself, dead, his face frozen in terror, and beside him a monstrous hound, black as pitch, with eyes that burned like fire. From that night onward, the manuscript warned, a curse had rested upon the Baskerville line. When Dr. Mortimer finished reading, silence filled the room. "You do not believe this tale literally, I presume?" Holmes said at last. "No," Dr. Mortimer replied quickly. "I am a man of science, but I do believe that fear can kill as surely as any weapon." Holmes leaned back in his chair. "And someone has died?" "Yes," said Dr. Mortimer quietly. "Sir Charles Baskerville." He went on to explain that Sir Charles had been found dead near the yew alley at Baskerville Hall. There were no signs of violence. His heart had failed. Yet nearby, upon the soft ground, were footprints, not human, but unmistakably those of a great hound. Holmes listened without interruption, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. "And you have come to me," he said, "because you fear for the life of the next heir." Dr. Mortimer nodded. "Sir Henry Baskerville arrives in England tomorrow." Holmes rose and walked slowly toward the window. "Then," he said, "the game is already in motion." Outside, the fog pressed close against the glass, thick and watchful, and though no sound reached us from the street below, I felt, with an unease I could not yet name, that something ancient and patient had begun to stir upon the lonely moors of Devonshire. Sherlock Holmes remained standing at the window long after Dr. Mortimer had finished speaking. His tall figure was framed against the grey London fog, which pressed softly against the glass, like some curious, living thing. When at last he turned back toward us, his expression was thoughtful rather than alarmed. "A most interesting problem," he said quietly. "Interesting precisely because it wears the mask of superstition." Dr. Mortimer shifted uneasily in his chair. "You believe, then, that the explanation is an earthly one?" Holmes inclined his head. "I believe that the human mind is capable of creating horrors far more convincing than any creature of legend. Fear, Doctor, is an instrument easily sharpened." "And yet," I interjected, "the footprints you mentioned are a fact," Holmes replied at once. "And facts, Watson, must always be respected, even when they appear to serve an absurd conclusion." Mortimer leaned forward. "And you will take the case?" Holmes did not answer immediately. Instead, he crossed the room and seated himself once more at the table, where the manuscript lay folded. He ran his fingers lightly along its edge, as though feeling the weight of the generations it represented. "I will advise," he said at last. "Whether I shall act depends upon what follows." Mortimer exhaled, as if relieved simply by that much. "There is more," he said. "Sir Henry Baskerville has already been the subject of a most peculiar occurrence." Holmes's eyes lifted at once. "Proceed." "This morning," Dr. Mortimer continued, "Sir Henry discovered that one of his boots had disappeared from his hotel room." "One boot?" Holmes asked mildly. "Yes, a new brown walking boot, purchased in London. It vanished without explanation. The old black boots remained untouched." Holmes smiled faintly. "A thief, with a very selective taste." "The boot was returned the following day," Dr. Mortimer added, "placed neatly outside Sir Henry's door." "A warning," Holmes murmured, "or a test." Dr. Mortimer looked between us. "Sir Henry is not a nervous man, but this business has unsettled him. He is the last of the Baskervilles. If the curse has any power at all," Holmes raised a hand gently, "let us leave curses to the poets. What matters is this. Someone wishes Sir Henry to believe he is in danger." "And you believe the danger is real?" I asked. Holmes met my gaze. "I believe that someone stands to gain from his fear." The clock on the mantelpiece ticked softly, marking the slow passage of time. Outside, the fog showed no sign of lifting. "Where is Sir Henry now?" Holmes asked. "At the Northumberland Hotel," Dr. Mortimer replied. "I have advised him to remain in London until he has consulted you." "Good," Holmes said. "London offers distractions. The moor offers only silence." At the sound of that word, Dr. Mortimer stiffened. "You have been there, Holmes?" he asked. "Not yet," Holmes replied. "But I shall be in due course." He rose once more and paced the room. "Watson," he said, "what do you know of Dartmoor?" "Very little," I admitted. "Only that it is bleak and sparsely populated." "And ancient," Holmes added. "A place where the land itself seems older than memory. Such landscapes are fertile ground for fear." Dr. Mortimer nodded gravely. "Sir Charles Baskerville believed the hound to be real. Belief," Holmes replied, "is often more dangerous than truth." There came a knock at the door. Hudson entered, announcing that Sir Henry Baskerville himself had arrived. A moment later, a broad-shouldered man stepped into the room, his face open and weathered, his manner that of one accustomed to directness rather than subtlety. Sir Henry greeted us warmly, though his eyes moved quickly, taking in the room and its occupants. "I am glad to meet you at last, Mr. Holmes," he said. "Dr. Mortimer speaks highly of your abilities." Holmes returned the greeting with polite reserve. "I understand you have lost a boot," he said. Sir Henry laughed shortly. "So I have. Or rather, I did. London seems to have a strange sense of humor." Holmes's gaze flicked to the man's coat. "You are being followed," he said calmly. Sir Henry stiffened. "I thought as much." Holmes crossed to the window and pointed discreetly. "See there, Watson, the man with the dark beard. He has been standing across the street since our visitor arrived." I peered through the glass and saw him at once, a solitary figure, half lost in the fog, pretending to study a shop window. "And there," Holmes continued, "is your answer, Sir Henry. Someone fears your movements enough to watch them closely." Sir Henry's expression hardened. "Then I will not run." "Nor should you," Holmes replied. "But you must not go to Baskerville Hall alone." He turned to me. "Watson," he said, "you will accompany Sir Henry to Devonshire." I started in surprise. "I? Yes," Holmes replied calmly. "You possess two qualities essential to this case: steadiness of nerve and the ability to observe without being observed." "And you?" I asked. Holmes smiled thinly. "I shall remain in London for the present." Sir Henry looked from one to the other. "Then a hunt begins." Holmes's voice dropped to a near whisper. "No," he said, "the hunt has already begun. We are merely choosing where we shall stand when the hound shows itself." The fire crackled softly in the hearth, and though the room was warm, I felt a chill settle over me, as if some distant wind from the moor had already found its way into Baker Street. The fog had thickened by the time we left Baker Street. It lay upon London like a heavy curtain, muting sound and blurring distance, so that even the familiar streets seemed uncertain beneath our feet. Sir Henry walked beside me with long, confident strides, yet I could sense the tension beneath his easy manner. We did not speak at first. The city itself appeared to listen. Only when we reached the broader thoroughfare did Sir Henry glance back over his shoulder. "He is still there," he said quietly. I followed his gaze and saw the man Holmes had pointed out earlier. He kept his distance, moving with practiced care, neither approaching nor falling behind. "You noticed him before Holmes spoke?" I asked. "Yes," Sir Henry replied. "I have been followed before." One learns the signs. "And yet you laughed about the missing boot." Sir Henry smiled faintly. "I prefer to laugh while I still can." We hailed a cab, and as it pulled away, the figure in the fog fell back, swallowed by the grey. Still, I did not feel reassured. At the hotel, Sir Henry retrieved his belongings, and we spoke briefly of the arrangements Holmes had made. We were to depart for Devonshire the following morning. Until then, Sir Henry was to remain in public view as much as possible. "That is Holmes's way," Sir Henry remarked. He shines a light and waits to see what flees, or what endures, I thought. That night, sleep came fitfully. More than once, I woke with the impression that I had heard footsteps in the corridor, though when I opened the door, there was nothing but silence and the dim glow of the lamps. Morning brought little clarity. The fog lingered, stubborn and unmoving, as though reluctant to release us. At the station, Holmes appeared briefly to see us off. His manner was unhurried, almost casual, yet his eyes missed nothing. He spoke little, offering only a few last words of instruction. "Observe," he said to me quietly. "Record. Trust nothing that presents itself willingly." "And you?" I asked. Holmes smiled. "I shall join you sooner than you think." With that, he stepped back, and the train carried us away. The journey was long and monotonous, the landscape slowly transforming from the dense sprawl of London into open fields and distant hills. Sir Henry grew more talkative as the miles passed, recounting memories of his youth in Canada, and speaking with affection of the uncle he had scarcely known. "Sir Charles was a kind man," he said. "He believed deeply in duty, and yet," he hesitated, "and yet he feared the hound," I finished. Sir Henry nodded. "He never spoke of it openly, but I saw the signs. He avoided the moor at night. He walked only in the company of others. Fear ages a man faster than time." As we drew closer to Devonshire, the sky darkened, clouds gathering low and heavy. The air itself seemed to change, growing damp and cold. When at last we arrived at the small station near Baskerville Hall, we were met by Dr. Mortimer, who greeted us with visible relief. "I am glad you have arrived safely," he said. "There have been developments." He led us to a carriage waiting outside. The road to the hall wound through open country, the land rising and falling gently until, at last, the moor appeared before us. I had heard descriptions of Dartmoor, yet none had prepared me for its desolate grandeur. The land stretched endlessly, broken only by jagged rocks and dark pools of water that reflected the sky like fragments of broken glass. "There," Dr. Mortimer said softly, pointing ahead. Baskerville Hall. The house stood against the horizon, large and somber, its stone walls darkened by age and weather. Even from a distance, it carried an air of isolation. As we approached, a figure emerged to greet us, Mr. Barrymore, the butler. His face was pale and drawn, his manner respectful yet restrained. "Welcome, Sir Henry," he said. "We are pleased to have you home." Home. The word sounded strange in such a place. Inside, the hall was quiet, its corridors long and echoing. The fire in the great hall burned brightly, yet failed to dispel the chill that seemed to cling to the stone. Mrs. Barrymore appeared shortly thereafter, her eyes red-rimmed, her hands trembling slightly as she poured tea. When she thought herself unobserved, I saw her glance repeatedly toward the windows, as though expecting something to appear beyond the glass. That evening, after Sir Henry retired, I found myself unable to sleep. The wind rose outside, moaning softly across the moor, its sound seeping through the walls like a distant lament. At one point, I thought I heard a cry, long, low, and filled with sorrow. I rose quietly and went to the window. The moor lay shrouded in darkness, the moon casting a pale, uncertain light across the rocks. There was nothing to see. And yet, as I stood there, listening, I could not shake the feeling that something was moving beyond the reach of sight, something patient, something ancient, waiting for the right moment to emerge from the shadows. I returned to my bed with the uneasy certainty that Baskerville Hall was not merely a place of stone and mortar, but a threshold, and that beyond it lay dangers still unseen. Morning came slowly to Baskerville Hall. The light that crept through the tall windows was pale and uncertain, as though even the sun hesitated to linger over the moor. I rose early and dressed quietly, my thoughts still occupied by the strange cry I had heard during the night. When I descended to the dining room, Sir Henry was already there, seated at the long table with an expression of thoughtful calm. He greeted me cheerfully enough, yet there was a tightness about his eyes that betrayed a restless night. "You heard it too, did not you?" he asked without preamble. "The sound?" I replied. "Yes." Sir Henry nodded. "Barrymore told me it was the wind." "And do you believe him?" He smiled faintly. "I have lived in wilder places than this, doctor. I know the voice of the wind." That was something else. Before I could respond, the butler himself entered, carrying the breakfast tray. His movements were precise, his expression carefully neutral. Yet, when Sir Henry questioned him again about the noise, I noticed a flicker of unease pass across his face. "The moor can play tricks on the ears at night, sir," Barrymore said. "Sounds travel strangely in the open." "Indeed," Sir Henry replied, "and so do secrets." Barrymore stiffened slightly, then bowed and withdrew. Later that morning, Sir Henry and I walked the grounds together. The land around the hall sloped gently downward, before rising again into the vast expanse of the moor. Even by daylight, it possessed an air of solemnity that weighed upon the spirit. As we walked, Sir Henry spoke more openly. "I have inherited more than an estate," he said. "I have inherited fear." "You need not accept it," I replied. "No," he said, "but others seem determined that I should." We had not gone far when we encountered Dr. Mortimer, who joined us eagerly. He spoke at length about the geology of the region, pointing out rock formations and ancient stone dwellings scattered across the moor. "These huts," he explained, "date back thousands of years. Long before Baskerville Hall was built, they appear abandoned," Sir Henry remarked. "Most are," Dr. Mortimer replied, "but not all." That remark caught my attention. "There are inhabitants upon the moor?" I asked. "Yes," he said slowly, "a few. Shepherds, farmers, and others who prefer solitude." As he spoke, I noticed a movement in the distance, a lone figure standing upon a rise, watching us. "Who is that?" I asked. Dr. Mortimer followed my gaze. His expression changed. "That," he said quietly, "is Mr. Stapleton." He explained that Stapleton was a naturalist, a man deeply interested in the wild life of the moor. He lived nearby with his sister, and though outwardly respectable, he was regarded by many as an eccentric. As if summoned by our attention, Stapleton soon approached, his long strides carrying him swiftly across the uneven ground. He greeted us warmly, his manner animated, his eyes bright with intelligence. "The moor is treacherous today," he said, gesturing toward the distant fog. "One misstep, and a man might vanish without a trace." Sir Henry regarded him steadily. "You speak from experience?" Stapleton laughed lightly. "From observation. I have spent years studying this land." He introduced his sister shortly thereafter, a striking woman with a reserved manner and a seriousness that contrasted sharply with her brother's enthusiasm. She spoke little, yet when her gaze met mine, I sensed an urgency beneath her calm exterior. As we parted ways, she lingered for a moment. "Sir Henry," she said softly, "do not wander upon the moor alone." Before he could respond, Stapleton called her away. The encounter left me uneasy. There was something unresolved in her warning, something she wished to say, but could not. That afternoon, as the fog rolled in once more, I explored the hall alone. The corridors seemed longer than before, their silence heavy. In a remote wing of the house, I came upon a locked door. "What lies beyond?" I asked Barrymore, when I encountered him later. "Storage rooms," he replied promptly, too promptly. That night, the sound returned. It came again from the moor, low, mournful, and prolonged. Sir Henry and I exchanged glances, neither willing to speak. The cry faded slowly, leaving behind a silence that pressed upon the ears. Later, unable to sleep, I rose quietly and walked to the corridor. As I passed the Barrymores' quarters, I saw a thin beam of light beneath their door. I paused. From within came the sound of whispered voices. I could not distinguish the words, but their tone was urgent, fearful. At last, the voices fell silent, and the light vanished. I returned to my room, troubled by the growing sense that Baskerville Hall was not merely threatened from without, but divided from within. The moor lay silent once more. Yet I knew, with a certainty that settled deep within me, that its silence was not empty. It was watchful. Sleep did not come easily that night. The moor lay quiet beyond the walls of Baskerville Hall, yet its silence felt strained, as though something waited just beyond the limits of hearing. I lay awake for some time, listening to the faint creaks of the old house and the distant sigh of the wind moving across the open land. At last, unable to rest, I rose once more and crossed to the window. The moon had emerged from behind the clouds, casting a pale light across the moor. The rocks and pools glimmered faintly, their shapes sharp and unforgiving. I stood there for several minutes, watching, until a small point of light caught my attention. It was distant, flickering briefly before vanishing. I leaned closer to the glass. The light appeared again, steady now, as though someone had struck a match and held it aloft. The direction was unmistakable. It came from the moor itself. My first thought was of the shepherd's doctor Mortimer had mentioned, but the hour was late, and the place from which the light shone appeared far removed from any path or dwelling I had yet seen. I dressed quickly and stepped into the corridor. The house was silent. Sir Henry's door remained closed, and I judged it best not to disturb him. Instead, I made my way quietly toward the rear of the hall, where a side entrance opened onto the grounds. As I reached the door, I heard footsteps behind me. Barrymore emerged from the shadows, his face pale in the dim light. "Doctor," he said softly, "you should not be about at this hour." "I might say the same to you," I replied. He hesitated, then sighed. "The night air unsettles me." "So it seems," I said. "Tell me, Mr. Barrymore, have you ever seen a light upon the moor after dark?" His eyes flicked away from mine. "No," he said quickly. It was enough. I stepped outside, the cold air biting at my face. The light was gone now, but I had marked its position. I began walking in that direction, careful to keep my footing upon the uneven ground. Behind me, I heard Barrymore call my name, but I did not turn back. The moor was a different world at night. The land seemed to stretch endlessly, each rise revealing another, darker expanse beyond. Sounds carried strangely. A distant movement might seem close, while nearby steps faded into nothing. After some time, I reached a low rise of rocks overlooking a shallow valley. There, half hidden among the stones, stood a small stone hut. The light appeared once more, glowing faintly through a narrow opening. I approached cautiously. The door stood ajar. Inside, the hut was bare save for a small table and a rough sleeping pallet. A man sat hunched over the table, his face shadowed, his clothes worn and patched. At the sound of my step, he looked up sharply. "Who is there?" he demanded. "I am Dr. Watson," I said. "A guest at Baskerville Hall." The man studied me for a moment, then relaxed slightly. "You should not be here," he said. "This place is not safe, nor, it seems, is the hall," I replied. "Who are you?" "A man who wishes to be left alone," he said. "That is all." I noticed then that he was missing one boot. My thoughts raced. "You have been watching the hall," I said. He did not deny it. "Someone must. Why?" Before he could answer, a sound drifted across the moor, low, deep, and filled with menace. It rose and fell slowly, echoing across the land. The man's face drained of color. "There," he whispered. "Do you hear it now?" I did not answer. The sound chilled me to the bone. When it faded at last, the man spoke again, his voice urgent. "You must leave this place. The moor is not what it seems." "Nor are you," I replied. "You followed Sir Henry in London." He looked away. I wished only to protect him. "From whom?" "From the same fate," exclaimed Sir Charles. Before I could press him further, the man extinguished the light and moved past me toward the door. "Go back to the hall," he said, "and tell your friend Holmes that the hound is no myth." With that, he vanished into the darkness. I returned to Baskerville Hall, shaken. The house loomed ahead, its windows dark, its stone walls unyielding. As I reached the door, Barrymore emerged once more, his face drawn. "You saw him?" he said quietly. "Yes," I replied. "And now you will tell me who he is." Barrymore hesitated, then spoke. "He is my wife's brother," he said, "an escaped convict." The truth settled heavily between us. "And the light?" I asked. "We bring him food," Barrymore said. "He hides upon the moor. We dare not turn him away." I nodded slowly. "Your secret is safe, for now." As I lay awake later that night, the image of the distant light lingered in my mind, along with the echo of that terrible cry. The moor held many secrets, and I feared we had uncovered only the least of them. The following morning broke with a low, colorless sky. The light that filtered into Baskerville Hall was thin and uncertain, as though the day itself had not yet decided whether to reveal or conceal what lay upon the moor. I rose early, my sleep having been shallow and restless, troubled by the events of the night before. Sir Henry had not yet descended, and the house lay quiet save for the faint movements of the servants beginning their day. I found myself lingering near the windows once more, gazing out across the open land. The moor stretched endlessly, its surface broken only by rocks and pools that reflected the dull sky above. What struck me most was not its vastness, but its patience. Later that morning Sir Henry joined me for breakfast. He appeared composed, yet I noticed how his eyes drifted repeatedly toward the distant hills. "You were out last night," he said casually. "Yes," I replied. "I could not sleep." "Nor could I," he admitted. "This place has a way of pressing upon one's thoughts." We spoke little more of it. Some matters resist easy discussion, settling instead into silence where they may be examined privately. Dr. Mortimer arrived shortly thereafter, bringing with him news from the village. Nothing concrete, nothing alarming, only fragments of rumor and suggestion. A shepherd had heard something moving at night. A farmer's dog had refused to leave its kennel. Small things easily dismissed, yet collectively unsettling. "The moor listens," Mortimer said quietly, "and when it does, people imagine it listens back." That afternoon, I walked alone along one of the paths that skirted the edge of the Grimpenmire. I did not venture close. The ground there was treacherous even by daylight, but I wished to understand its presence. The mire lay still, its surface unbroken, giving no indication of the danger it concealed beneath. It occurred to me, then, how closely fear resembled such a place, calm above, uncertain below. As I turned back toward the hall, I noticed a figure in the distance, a man moving slowly, deliberately, as though measuring each step. He remained far enough away that I could not distinguish his features, yet there was something familiar in his bearing. He stopped when I stopped. For several moments we stood thus, separated by distance and silence. Then, without gesture or sign, he turned and walked away, soon disappearing into the uneven folds of the land. I returned to the hall with an unease I could not name. That evening, the wind rose again, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and distant peat. The servants moved quietly, their voices hushed, their expressions guarded. Mrs. Barrymore avoided my gaze entirely, while her husband seemed unusually watchful. As night fell, the cry returned. It was distant, drawn out, and filled with a resonance that seemed to vibrate through the stone walls themselves. Sir Henry froze, his hand tightening round the arm of his chair. "That," he said quietly, "is not imagination." "No," I replied, "it is not." The sound faded gradually, leaving behind a silence more oppressive than before. Later, as the house settled, I found myself once again awake. I moved quietly through the corridor, my steps careful upon the worn carpet. As I passed the Barrymores' quarters, I saw light beneath the door and heard voices, low, urgent, strained. I did not linger long enough to intrude, but I understood then that whatever secrets the house held were not confined to the Moor alone. Returning to my room, I sat for some time by the window. The moon had risen, casting a pale glow across the land. In that light, the Moor appeared almost gentle, deceptive in its calm. Yet I felt certain that events were drawing closer together, that the quiet we experienced was not resolution, but gathering. Somewhere beyond sight, plans were unfolding, and though I could not yet see their shape, I knew with growing certainty that we were no longer merely observing the mystery of Baskerville Hall, we were moving within it. Several days passed at Baskerville Hall without outward incident, yet the atmosphere grew steadily more oppressive. The moor lay beneath, a shifting veil of mist, sometimes lifting just enough to reveal its vastness, only to close again as though guarding its secrets. Sir Henry maintained a brave front, walking the grounds each morning and dining with good humor in the evenings, but I observed how his eyes were drawn again and again toward the windows as dusk approached. It was on the fourth morning after my encounter upon the moor that the letter arrived. It was brought in with the rest of the post and placed upon the breakfast table. At first glance it appeared unremarkable, a simple envelope, unadorned, addressed to Sir Henry in block letters of careful precision. There was no return address. Sir Henry slid it open at once. As he read, his expression darkened. "What is it?" I asked. He handed me the letter without a word. The message was brief. "If you value your life, keep away from the moor." That was all. No signature. No explanation. Sir Henry laughed shortly, though the sound lacked conviction. "It seems I am the recipient of much concern, or much hostility," I replied. Dr. Mortimer examined the envelope closely. "The paper is common, the ink ordinary. There is nothing here to distinguish the sender." "On the contrary," I said, "there is a great deal." They looked at me in surprise. "The sender knows this house," I continued, "knows our habits, knows when the post arrives, and wishes to be taken seriously." Sir Henry folded the letter and placed it carefully in his pocket. "I will not be driven from my own land by anonymous threats," he said firmly. That afternoon, Stapleton called upon us. He arrived with his usual energy, speaking enthusiastically of rare moths and the changing conditions upon the moor. Yet I noticed how his gaze lingered upon Sir Henry, studying him with a curiosity that went beyond polite interest. "You must be cautious," Stapleton said at one point, lowering his voice. "The moor is treacherous. Even those who know it well can be lost." Sir Henry regarded him steadily. "I have been warned already." Stapleton's eyes flickered. "Indeed, by letter," Sir Henry said. Stapleton laughed lightly. "Then you are already famous here." Later, as Stapleton prepared to leave, his sister lingered behind once more. Her face was pale, her expression troubled. "Sir Henry," she said softly, "please promise me you will not go on to the moor alone." He smiled kindly. "I promise nothing, but I thank you for your concern." Her lips parted, as if she wished to say more, but Stapleton called her sharply, and she turned away at once. That evening the wind rose again, rattling the windows and sending long shadows dancing across the walls. The cry returned, distant, mournful, and unmistakable. Sir Henry stiffened. "That," he said quietly, "is no ordinary animal." "No," I agreed. "It is something meant to be heard." As the sound faded, a knock came at the door. Barrymore entered, his face strained. "Doctor," he said, "there is someone asking for you." "For me?" I asked. "Yes," he replied. "A man from the village." I followed him into the corridor, where a small, nervous-looking fellow waited, twisting his cap in his hands. "I was told you might be interested," he said. "I saw someone last night, on the moor." "Who?" I asked. "A gentleman," he replied, "tall, thin, watching the hall." My pulse quickened. "Did you recognize him?" "No, sir." "But he had a beard, and he carried himself like a man used to command." Holmes. The thought struck me with sudden force. "Where did you see him?" I asked. "Near the old stone huts," the man replied. I thanked him and dismissed him, my mind racing. That night I could not sleep. I paced my room, listening to the wind and watching the moonlight creep slowly across the floor. Holmes was here, or if not here, then very near, and yet he had not revealed himself. The realization brought both comfort and unease. If Holmes chose to remain hidden, it meant the danger was closer than we believed. Near dawn, I heard a faint sound outside my window, the soft crunch of footsteps upon gravel. I drew the curtain aside, just enough to peer out. A figure stood below, half concealed by shadow. He raised his head slightly, and though his face was indistinct, I knew him at once. He placed a finger to his lips, then he was gone. I returned to my bed with a strange calm settling over me. The game had entered a new phase. Holmes was upon the moor, and the hound, whether of flesh or fear, would soon be forced from hiding. The knowledge that Holmes was near altered everything, though outwardly nothing had changed. Baskerville Hall remained silent and solemn. The moor stretched endlessly beneath its veil of mist, and Sir Henry continued his routines with quiet determination. Yet beneath the surface, a new current moved, subtle, deliberate, unseen. Holmes had always preferred to observe before acting. That he chose to remain hidden here, of all places, told me that the danger was both real and close. I did not mention his presence to Sir Henry. Holmes had signaled for silence, and I obeyed. That morning I walked alone upon the grounds, allowing Sir Henry to remain indoors, under the pretense of reviewing estate matters. The air was damp, heavy with the scent of peat and earth. As I approached the edge of the moor, I felt again that sensation of being watched. I did not turn. Instead, I spoke quietly, as though addressing the land itself. "You may as well show yourself." There was a pause. Then from behind a cluster of rocks, a familiar tall figure emerged. Holmes stepped into view, his coat dusted with moorland soil, his expression alert yet composed. "You are improving, Watson," he said softly. Few men learn to listen with their backs. I felt a rush of relief at the sound of his voice. "You could have spared me some anxiety," I replied. Holmes smiled faintly. "Anxiety sharpens the senses. Besides, you have done admirably." We walked together in silence for some distance. the moor opening before us, like a vast, living map. "You have met the convict," Holmes said at last. "Yes," I replied, "and learned of the Barrymore's secret." "Good," Holmes said. "Then you will understand that he is not our villain." "No," I agreed. "He is frightened and protective." "Precisely," Holmes replied, "which makes him useful." I told Holmes of the letter, of Stapleton and his sister, of the light upon the moor and the cries in the night. He listened intently, absorbing each detail without interruption. "And Sir Henry?" he asked. "Brave," I said, "but increasingly isolated." Holmes nodded. "Isolation is the objective." We reached a low ridge overlooking the valley where the stone huts lay scattered. Holmes stopped and pointed. "From here," he said, "one can observe Baskerville Hall without being seen. Note the prevailing wind, the natural cover, the paths hidden by the fog." "You believe the hound is kept somewhere nearby?" I asked. Holmes did not answer directly. "I believe," he said slowly, "that the illusion of the hound is as important as the creature itself." Before I could press him further, he turned away. "Do not seek me out again," he said. "Act as though you have not seen me." "And if Sir Henry is in danger?" I asked. Holmes met my gaze. "Then I shall appear." He vanished once more into the mist, leaving behind only footprints that quickly faded into the damp earth. That afternoon, Stapleton returned. He invited Sir Henry to dine at his home, a modest dwelling set at the edge of the moor. Despite my reservations, Sir Henry accepted. He seemed eager for any diversion from the oppressive atmosphere of the hall. We set out in the early evening, the sky already darkening. Stapleton led the way, speaking animatedly of his studies, pointing out birds and insects even as the light faded. His sister greeted us quietly when we arrived. She seemed troubled, her eyes darting nervously towards the moor beyond the house. During dinner, Stapleton spoke at length, yet I noticed how carefully he avoided any mention of the hound or the curse. It was as though he wished to present the moor as harmless, even inviting. When the meal ended, his sister drew Sir Henry aside. "You must listen to me," she said urgently. "You are in grave danger." Stapleton peered at once, his voice sharp. "Enough, Beryl." She recoiled slightly, then fell silent. We departed shortly thereafter, the tension lingering like a fog between us. As we walked back toward the hall, the moon rose, casting long shadows across the path. The moor seemed to awaken under its pale light. Halfway home, Sir Henry paused. "Do you hear that?" he asked. I listened. At first, there was nothing. Then, faintly, a sound drifted across the land, low, rhythmic, and unmistakably alive. The cry rose again, closer now. Sir Henry's breath quickened. "It is following us." "Stay close," I said, my own heart pounding. The sound grew louder, echoing across the rocks, filled with a terrible vitality that defied explanation. It was no mere animal call. It carried intent. Suddenly, from the darkness ahead, a shape appeared, large, swift, and luminous. For a moment, I could see nothing clearly, only the impression of great size and burning eyes. Then the creature veered away, disappearing as swiftly as it had come. Silence fell once more. Sir Henry leaned heavily upon his stick. "You saw it?" he said hoarsely. "Yes," I replied. "I saw something." We reached the hall without further incident, but sleep eluded us both that night. The image of that glowing shape haunted my thoughts. Yet even as fear pressed upon me, another thought took hold. Holmes had allowed this to happen, which meant that whatever stopped the moor was nearing the end of its freedom. And soon, the truth, terrible or mundane, would no longer remain hidden in the mist. The events of the previous night cast a long shadow over Baskerville Hall. Morning arrived, shrouded in thick mist, a moor hidden entirely from view, as though it sought to conceal itself from inquiry. Sir Henry appeared at breakfast, pale but resolute, his jaw set with a determination that bordered on defiance. "I will not be frightened into submission," he said quietly, stirring his tea with deliberate calm. "Whatever stalks this land, it bleeds like any other creature." "Courage is admirable," I replied, "but caution may yet save your life." He smiled faintly. "Holmes would agree with you." I did not respond. Holmes' unseen presence weighed heavily upon my thoughts. His silence suggested that matters were unfolding precisely as he intended. Later that morning, I ventured into the village under the pretense of gathering supplies. The path wound gently downward, bordered by low stone walls and hedges twisted by years of wind. The villagers greeted me politely, yet I sensed a guardedness beneath their courtesy. At the small inn, I encountered a man who watched me with particular interest. He was broad and ruddy, with keen eyes and a manner that suggested both intelligence and unease. "You are from the Hall," he said, not as a question, but a statement. "Yes," I replied. "Dr. Watson?" He nodded. "Name's Frankland. I have lived here all my life." We spoke briefly of trivial matters, but I soon steered the conversation toward the moor. "Strange place," Frankland said, lowering his voice. "Not fit for wandering alone, yet some do," I remarked. His eyes flickered. "Aye, and some regret it." Before I could ask more, he excused himself abruptly, leaving me with the impression that he knew more than he wished to share. As I left the inn, I noticed Stapleton standing across the road, speaking with another villager. When he saw me, he raised a hand in greeting and crossed over. "Doctor," he said warmly. "Out exploring?" "Merely observing," I replied. "A worthy pursuit," he said, "though one must be careful what one observes, and who observes in return." His words struck me as oddly pointed. "Tell me," I said, "you spend a great deal of time upon the moor. You've ever encountered anything unusual?" Stapleton laughed softly. "Unusual is a matter of perspective. To the untrained eye, every shadow is a threat. And to the trained?" I asked. "To the trained," he replied, "a shadow is merely an absence of light." We parted soon after, yet his words lingered with me as I made my way back toward the hall. That afternoon, Sir Henry received another visitor. A telegram arrived from London, brief and urgent. "Arriving soon. Remain vigilant." S.H. Sir Henry read it twice, then handed it to me. "So," he said quietly, "the hunter draws nearer." "Yes," I replied, and the hunted rose desperate. As evening fell, the fog lifted slightly, revealing the moor in stark relief beneath a blood-red sunset. The air was still, unnervingly so. Sir Henry insisted on a short walk before nightfall. Against my better judgment, I accompanied him, keeping to the path and remaining alert. We had gone no more than half a mile when we saw a figure approaching. It was the convict, thin, wary, moving swiftly across the uneven ground. He stopped when he saw us, raising his hands in a gesture of peace. "I must speak with you," he said urgently. "There is little time." Sir Henry stiffened. "You followed me." "Yes," the man replied, "to protect you." "From what?" Sir Henry demanded. The man glanced nervously toward the horizon. "From the one who controls the beast." My heart quickened. "You know who it is?" He nodded. "I have seen him upon the moor. I have watched him feed it." Sir Henry stepped closer. "Who?" Before the man could answer, a sound cut through the stillness, the familiar low, resonant cry. The convict's face contorted with fear. "It comes." From the mist ahead, a shape emerged, moving swiftly and with dreadful purpose. The glow of its eyes pierced the gathering dusk. "Run!" I shouted. The convict turned and fled, vanishing into the fog. Sir Henry hesitated, transfixed. "Sir Henry!" I cried, seizing his arm. The creature closed the distance. With terrifying speed, its form resolving into a massive hound, its jaws agape, its eyes burning with unnatural light. Suddenly, from the side, a figure leapt forward. A sharp crack echoed across the moor. The hound stumbled, faltered, then collapsed. Holmes stepped into view, smoke rising from his revolver. "Are you injured?" he asked calmly. Sir Henry stared, speechless. Holmes approached the fallen beast, examining it with clinical detachment. "Phosphorus," he murmured, applied to enhance the illusion. He straightened and met my gaze. "The game is nearly over, Watson," he said, "but the most dangerous move is yet to come." The Moor fell silent once more, and though the hound lay motionless at our feet, I felt no sense of relief, only the certainty that the true threat still walked among us, cloaked not in fur and flame, but in human flesh. For a long moment after the hound fell, none of us spoke. The moor lay silent once more, the mist thinning just enough to reveal the lifeless form at our feet. Its great body was still, the dreadful glow of its eyes fading rapidly until they were nothing more than dull reflections of the dying light. Sir Henry broke the silence first. "Is it dead?" he asked quietly. "Yes," Holmes replied, "quite dead." He knelt beside the animal, examining it with the same calm attention he might have given a broken watch or a curious stain upon a sleeve. "You see, Watson," he said, "there is no mystery in the creature itself, only in the manner of its use. The hound was enormous, its jaws powerful, its limbs built for speed. Even in death, it inspired a measure of dread." "And the light?" Sir Henry asked. "Phosphorus," Holmes answered, "painted upon muzzle and eyes. In darkness, it transforms a beast into a spectre." Sir Henry shuddered. "Then the curse is a fiction," Holmes said gently, "but a carefully nurtured one." He rose and turned toward the fog where the convict had fled. "He knew too much," Holmes said, "which is why he was allowed to know it." "You allowed the hound to pursue him?" I asked. Holmes met my gaze. "I allowed the illusion to be maintained." The danger to Sir Henry remained controlled. Sir Henry stared at him. "You used me as bait." Holmes inclined his head slightly. "Only because you were never in true danger, while I stood watch." Sir Henry considered this, then nodded slowly. "I suppose I should be grateful." "We must return to the hall," Holmes said. "Night is falling, and our adversary will soon realize his mistake." We made our way back in silence. The path seemed shorter now, as though the moor itself had relaxed its grip. Yet I could not shake the feeling that eyes still watched us from the darkness. At the hall, Holmes wasted no time. He gathered us in the sitting room and spoke in low, measured tones. "Our enemy," he said, "is clever, patient, and deeply invested in this charade. He believes fear to be his strongest ally." "Stapleton," I said quietly. Holmes nodded. "Stapleton." Sir Henry stiffened. "The naturalist?" "A naturalist indeed," Holmes replied. "One who understands animals and men." He explained how Stapleton had acquired the hound, trained it, and concealed it upon the moor. The legend of the curse provided the perfect cover, allowing him to manipulate events from the shadows. "And his motive?" Sir Henry asked. "Inheritance," Holmes replied. "He is a Baskerville by blood, though not by name. Remove you, and the estate passes to him." Sir Henry's expression darkened. "And the woman, his wife," Holmes said, "not his sister. A woman trapped by fear, much like the rest of us. The fire crackled softly as the truth settled upon us. What happens now? I asked. Holmes's eyes gleamed. Now, we wait. That night, Holmes insisted Sir Henry retire early. Under the watchful eye of Barrymore, I remained awake with Holmes, observing the grounds from the window. Hours passed. At last, a movement caught Holmes's attention. There, he whispered, a figure moved cautiously across the lawn, keeping close to the shadows. Even at a distance, I recognized a tall, spare outline. Stapleton. He approached the hall with deliberate care, pausing frequently to listen. At last, he reached the window beneath Sir Henry's room and raised his hand. Holmes sprang into action. Now, he said. We burst from the house, our footsteps loud upon the gravel. Stapleton turned, startled, his eyes wide. With sudden realization, he ran. Holmes and I followed, the night air sharp in our lungs. Stapleton fled toward the moor, his familiarity with the land giving him an advantage, but the fog betrayed him. He stumbled, then disappeared with a cry. We reached the edge moments later. Below us lay the treacherous expanse of the Grimpenmire, its surface deceptively calm. There is no escape that way, Holmes said quietly. A final sound echoed from the darkness below, then silence. We returned to the hall as dawn began to break, the sky lightening slowly over the moor. Sir Henry awaited us, pale but composed. It is over, then? He asked. Yes, Holmes replied. The hound is dead. The hunter has fallen into his own trap. Sir Henry bowed his head. As the first light of morning touched Baskerville Hall, I felt the oppressive weight that had lingered for so long finally begin to lift. Yet even in victory, there was a solemnity to the moment. For the Moor, ancient and indifferent, had claimed another secret and would doubtless keep it forever. The dawn that followed our return to Baskerville Hall arrived without drama. There was no sudden burst of sunlight, no triumphant clearing of clouds. Instead, the light seeped slowly across the moor, pale and diffused, as though the land itself were reluctant to acknowledge what had occurred during the night. Sir Henry slept late that morning. Holmes insisted upon it, explaining that exhaustion, once permitted to settle, should be respected rather than resisted. Barrymore moved quietly about the house, his usual restraint softened by a visible sense of relief. Even Miss Barrymore, whose anxious glances had so often betrayed her unease, appeared calmer than I had yet seen her. Holmes and I sat together in the great hall, the fire reduced now to embers, the room filled with a gentle grey light. You are unusually silent, I remarked at last. Holmes did not look up from the papers spread before him. Silence, he said, is often the most honest reaction to resolution. I watched him as he worked. His movements were deliberate but unhurried, his expression thoughtful rather than triumphant. The excitement of pursuit had faded, replaced by something quieter, contemplation perhaps, or the slow satisfaction of order restored. The Moor will remember, I said. Holmes glanced at me. The Moor remembers everything. It simply does not speak of it. Later that morning, we ventured outside. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of wet earth and distant heat fires. The Grimpenmere lay hidden behind a low veil of mist, deceptively calm, betraying nothing of the role it had played. There, Holmes said, pointing with his stick, the path Stapleton took. He believed himself master of this land. And the land corrected him, I replied. Holmes nodded, as it always does. Dr. Mortimer joined us shortly thereafter. He listened gravely as Holmes recounted the final events, though much of it he already suspected. The tragedy, Mortimer said quietly, is not merely that he died. but that he lived so long by fear. Yes, Holmes replied. Fear sustained him. It sharpened his patience and dulled his conscience. Sir Henry joined us later. His demeanor altered subtly, but unmistakably. The strain that had haunted his eyes was gone, replaced by a steadier resolve. I slept, he said simply, for the first time since arriving here. Holmes regarded him with approval. Then the worst is behind you, is it? Sir Henry asked. Holmes considered this. The past never releases us entirely, but it can be made quiet. That afternoon, arrangements were made. News of Stapleton's disappearance spread quickly through the village, though its details remained vague. Some spoke of an accident, others of misadventure. No one spoke of hounds or curses, not loud at least. Holmes advised restraint. Legends, he said, die slowly, best not to provoke them. As evening approached, I found myself walking once more along the edge of the moor. The land stretched endlessly, its contours softened by distance and fading light. A solitary bird cried somewhere far off, its call echoing briefly before dissolving into silence. I thought of the nights filled with dread, of the distant howls and flickering lights, of the sense of being watched by something unseen. Now there was only stillness, yet it was not emptiness. It was the quiet that follows upheaval, cautious, tentative, as though world itself were listening for any remaining disturbance. That night, as we dined together for what would soon be the final time, Holmes spoke little. Sir Henry, however, seemed eager to fill the silence. I intend to remain here, he said, to restore the hall, to make it a place of life rather than fear. A wise decision, Holmes replied. Occupation leaves little room for superstition. Sir Henry smiled. And I will walk the moor again. Holmes raised an eyebrow. Not alone, I trust. Not alone, Sir Henry agreed. Later, as the house settled into sleep, I joined Holmes by the window once more. The moon hung low over the moor, its light gentle rather than stark. You will leave tomorrow, I said. Yes, Holmes replied. London waits. And yet, I added, you will miss this place. Holmes was silent for a moment. There are landscapes, he said at last, that reflect the mind. The moor is one of them, vast, layered, capable of concealment and revelation in equal measure. I watched as he turned away from the window. The case is concluded, he said, but its echoes will remain. As I retired that night, sleep came easily. The house creaked softly, the wind whispered the eaves, and the moor lay quiet beyond the walls. For the first time since our arrival, the silence felt natural. And in that silence, the shadow of the hound finally loosened its grip upon Baskerville Hall. The morning of our departure from Baskerville Hall arrived quietly. There was no urgency in the house, no hurried footsteps or raised voices. Instead, the servants moved with an ease that spoke of burdens lifted, and the hall itself seemed to breathe more freely, as though a long-held tension had finally been released. Holmes requested that we breakfast together before leaving. Sir Henry joined us, looking rested and composed, his manner that of a man already turning his thoughts toward the future. You promised me an explanation, Sir Henry said, once we were seated. Not the brief version, the full one. Holmes smiled faintly. Very well, Watson, you may find it useful to listen closely. There are elements here that reward patience. Holmes began not with the hound, nor with Stapleton, but with the manuscript. The legend of the Baskerville curse, he said, was never intended as mere superstition. It was a warning, one that could be revived whenever it suited a clever mind. He explained how Stapleton, but Baskerville by descent, had discovered his lineage through careful research, Rather than claiming his inheritance openly, he chose a suppler path. He understood, Holmes continued, that fear can do what force cannot. It weakens judgment. It isolates. It persuades men to act against their own interests. Sir Henry listened intently. The hound itself, Holmes went on, was real enough, a powerful animal, trained with patience and at cruelty, but it was never meant to kill indiscriminately. It was meant to be seen. And Sir Charles? Sir Henry asked quietly. His heart, Holmes replied, was already fragile. The sudden confrontation with what he believed to be a supernatural force was enough. Fear finished what nature began. A silence followed. And me? Sir Henry asked. You, Holmes said, were intended to vanish, either through terror or accident. The mire would have served as a convenient conclusion. Sir Henry exhaled slowly. Then, it was you who prevented it. Holmes inclined his head. With Watson's assistance. I felt a quiet satisfaction at that. Holmes then spoke of his decision to remain hidden upon the moor. Stapleton believed himself unobserved, Holmes said, which encouraged him to act. Observation, when unnoticed, is the most powerful position one can occupy. And the convict? Sir Henry asked. A distraction, Holmes replied. Unfortunate, but useful. His presence explained movements upon the moor that might otherwise have drawn suspicion. Sir Henry's expression darkened. He died because of this. Yes, Holmes said softly. And that is the cost we must acknowledge. When Holmes finished, the room felt heavier, though the air itself remained calm. After breakfast, we walked once more upon the grounds. The moor lay open beneath a clear sky, its vastness no longer threatening, merely expansive. You will do well here, Holmes said to Sir Henry, but remember, do not attempt to erase the past. Learn from it. Sir Henry nodded. I will honor it without fearing it. By midday our carriage stood ready. Barrymore and his wife saw us off, their gratitude evident in every word. As we departed, I looked back at Baskerville Hall one fine time. It stood, as it always had, ancient, solemn, and enduring, yet something had changed. It was no longer waiting. The journey back to London was uneventful. Holmes spent much of it in silence, gazing out the window as the moor gave way to fields, and fields to towns. Another case concluded, I remarked. Yes, Holmes replied. And another reminder. Of what? That the most convincing monsters are those we create ourselves. Night fell as we approached London. The familiar glow of the city rose to meet us, comforting in its constancy. Back at Baker Street, Mrs. Hudson greeted us warmly. The sitting room felt unchanged, yet after the moor, it seemed almost intimate. As Holmes settled into his chair and reached for his pipe, I felt a sense of completion, not triumph, but closure. The hound no longer haunted my thoughts. Yet the moor, with its silence and secrets, remained with me still, not as a place of terror, but as a reminder that beneath every legend lies a truth, waiting patiently for someone to uncover it. And with that thought, the long shadow cast by Baskerville Hall finally faded into memory. Life at Baker Street resumed its familiar rhythm with remarkable ease. The city moved as it always had, carriages rattling over stone, voices rising and falling beyond the windows, the steady pulse of London continuing without pause. And yet for me, something had shifted. I found myself waking earlier than usual, the memory of wide skies and open land lingering even as I looked upon brick walls and narrow streets. The moor had left its mark, not as fear, but as distance, a reminder of how small human concerns could appear when set against something vast, ancient. Holmes noticed the change at once. You are restless, he observed one morning, folding his newspaper with deliberate care. Perhaps, I replied. The quiet of Devonshire lingers. Holmes smiled faintly. The mind resists confinement after tasting open space. That day passed without visitors, a rarity that Holmes welcomed. He spent the afternoon experimenting with chemical solutions at his work table, the sharp scent of reagents filling the room. I occupied myself with my notes, rearranging observations from the case with a precision that felt almost ceremonial. By evening, rain had begun to fall, tapping softly against the windows. The sound was gentle, rhythmic, not unlike the distant murmur of wind across the moor. Holmes set aside his work and reached for his violin. The music that followed was slow and restrained, each note placed with careful intent. It was not a performance meant to impress, but one designed to settle the mind, to bring order to lingering thoughts. As I listened, my mind wandered back to Baskerville Hall, to the long corridors, the flickering firelight, the way shadows seemed to stretch and contract with the movement of the flame. "Do you ever reflect upon the cost of your work?" I asked quietly, when the music ceased. Holmes considered this. "Frequently," he replied, "but reflection must never become regret. Regret clouds judgment. And yet," I said, "there are those who suffer unseen." "Yes," Holmes agreed, "which is why one must act with care. Every solution carries a shadow." Several days later, news reached us from Devonshire. Sir Henry wrote to say that work upon the estate had begun in earnest. Repairs were underway, paths cleared, and plans laid for gatherings that would bring warmth and presence back to the hall. "The land responds to occupation," Holmes remarked, as I read the letter aloud. "Empty spaces invite imagination." Sir Henry also wrote of the villagers. Fear had begun to loosen its grip, replaced by cautious optimism. The legend of the Hound, while not forgotten, had lost much of its power. "It will fade," Holmes said, "and actions always do, unless they are fed." That evening, as dusk settled over the city, a visitor arrived unexpectedly. Dr. Mortimer. He appeared older than I remembered, though his eyes retained their sharp intelligence. We welcomed him warmly, and he spoke at length of his return to the moor following our departure. "There is a stillness now," he said, "not the oppressive kind, a natural one." "And the mire?" I asked. "It remains," Mortimer replied, "as it always will. Some dangers cannot be removed, only understood." Holmes nodded approvingly. "Understanding is often sufficient." Mortimer departed late, leaving us once more alone with our thoughts. The rain had ceased, and the city lay quiet beneath a soft mist. I stood at the window, watching the lamplight glow upon the street below. "Do you believe the moor is truly at peace?" I asked. Holmes joined me. "For now," he said, "peace is rarely permanent, but it need not be." The days that followed were gentle ones. Holmes declined several cases, choosing instead to read, play music, and engage in quiet experimentation. It was as though he, too, felt the need to rest after the intensity of recent events. One evening, as we shared a simple supper, Holmes spoke again of Stapleton. "He was not born a villain," Holmes said. "He became one through patience and resentment." "You pity him," I observed. "No," Holmes replied. "I understand him. There is a difference." Silence followed, comfortable and unforced. Later that night, as I prepared for bed, I paused at my desk, where my notes lay neatly stacked. I considered the story they told, of fear exploited, of reason prevailing, of the thin line between myth and reality. I extinguished the lamp and lay down, the sounds of the city distant and subdued. Sleep came easily, and as it did, the image of the moor returned once more, not as a place of menace, but as a wide, open expanse, beneath a quiet sky, holding its secrets without urgency, a place where echoes remained, not to haunt, but to remind. The weeks that followed settled into a gentle pattern, one that felt almost unfamiliar after the long tension of the moor. Baker Street resumed its role as a place of measured thought and quiet industry. Holmes rose late, as was his habit when no urgent case demanded his attention, and spent long hours absorbed in books or in the soft, deliberate practice of his violin. For my own part, I returned to my medical duties with renewed steadiness. Patients came and went, each carrying concerns that felt immediate and personal, yet modest when compared to the sweeping fears we had recently encountered. Still, I found that my patience had deepened. The moor had taught me the value of listening, not merely to words, but to silences. One afternoon, Holmes surprised me by suggesting a walk. London can be as instructive as any wilderness, he remarked, taking his coat from the peg, if one knows how to observe it. We walked without destination, passing through streets that shifted subtly from bustle to calm. The city seemed softer than usual, the air touched with the promise of spring. Holmes spoke little, yet his attention never wavered. A gesture here, a glance there. All were noted, weighed, and filed away. "You miss it," I said eventually. "The moor?" Holmes replied, "Yes." He considered this. "I miss the clarity it enforced. When the horizon is distant, the mind must arrange itself." "And here?" I asked. "Here," he said, gesturing round us, "the mind is tempted to scatter." That evening, a letter arrived from Devonshire. Sir Henry wrote, with a warmth that spoke of renewal. The hall had begun to host small gatherings, dinners, modest at first, attended by neighbors who had long kept their distance. Laughter had returned to rooms that once echoed only with footsteps. "The house is changing," Sir Henry wrote, "or perhaps it is merely revealing what it was always capable of being." Holmes read the letter twice before handing it back to me. "He will do well," he said. "He understands that fear is not conquered by denial, but by presence." At days lengthened, the light in our sitting room lingered longer each evening. Holmes often played his violin at dusk, favoring slower melodies that seemed to stretch time rather than mark it. The sound drifted gently through the open window, mingling with the distant noise of the street. One night, as the music faded, Holmes spoke again of the hound. "Do you know what made it effective?" he asked. "The legend," I replied. "Partly," he said, "but more than that, anticipation. Fear thrives in waiting." I nodded. "The cry in the night?" "Yes," Holmes said, "sound without form, enough to allow the mind to construct its own terror." He fell silent, and I sensed that the thought carried deeper meaning for him, perhaps a reflection upon the unseen dangers that so often formed the substance of his work. Later, as I prepared my notes, I found myself lingering over certain passages, not the moments of action, but the quieter intervals between them. The walks, the conversations, the pauses, heavy with implication. These, I realized, were the true fabric of the case. Sleep came easily that night. I dreamed not of pursuit or revelation, but of wide skies and open land, for a Frothersen that neither advanced nor retreated, simply remained. In the days that followed, Holmes received visitors again, clients, with puzzles both large and small. He addressed them with his usual precision. Yet I noticed gentler patience in his manner, willingness to allow solutions to unfold rather than force them. Perhaps the moor had taught him something as well. One afternoon, As rain pattered softly against the windows, Holmes set aside his papers and looked at me thoughtfully. "Watson," he said, "do you believe that peace is an absence or a presence?" "I believe," I replied, "that peace is felt most clearly after disturbance." Holmes smiled. "An excellent answer." At evening, as the lamps were lit and the city settled into its nocturnal rhythm, I stood once more at the window. The street below glowed softly, orderly, and contained. Far away, beyond fields and towns, the moor lay under the same sky, vast, patient, unchanged. And yet it no longer felt distant, for in its quiet lessons of patience, of observation, of fear confronted rather than fled, it had found its way into the heart of ordinary days, days that now passed without urgency, days that were, in their own way, complete. As spring settled fully upon London, the city seemed to exhale. The sharp edges of winter softened, and with them the urgency that so often pressed upon our days. At Baker Street, this change was subtle but unmistakable. Holmes allowed himself longer pauses between cases, and when he did accept work, he approached it with a deliberation that suggested reflection rather than haste. For my own part, I found comfort in routine, morning rounds, afternoon consultations, evening notes. Each carried a sense of grounding that contrasted gently with the intensity of our recent experiences. Yet beneath this calm, my thoughts often wandered. I realized that the moor had altered not only my understanding of fear, but my relationship with quiet. Silence, I had learned, was not always emptiness. Sometimes it was a presence, one that invited thought rather than fleeing it. Holmes seemed to arrive at a similar conclusion. One evening, as we sat together after supper, he spoke without looking up from his book. "Watson," he said, "have you ever noticed how few people are comfortable doing nothing?" I smiled faintly. "I encounter it daily." "Doing nothing," Holmes continued, "is not inactivity. It is observation without interference." He closed the book and set it aside. "During the case at Baskerville," he said, "there were moments when the most effective action was restraint." I thought of the nights he had remained hidden upon the moor, watching without revealing himself. "Yes," I replied, "you allowed events to unfold." "Precisely," he said, "and in doing so, revealed their true shape." A letter arrived that night, bearing the familiar hand of Sir Henry. He wrote of continued progress at the Hall, Sharp's floor, furred walls, and evenings filled with conversation rather than apprehension. Villagers had begun to regard the estate, not as a place of legend, but as a neighbor once more. "The land responds to attention," Holmes observed as I finished reading. "Neglect breeds imagination." Later that week, Holmes surprised me again by declining an invitation from Scotland Yard. The case offered complexity and challenge, yet Holmes waved it aside with a calm certainty. "Not every problem requires immediate resolution," he said. "Some benefit from distance." Instead, he spent the afternoon walking alone, returning with his coat dusted lightly from the road and his expression thoughtful. "You have been mapping," I remarked. "Yes," he replied. "Not places, patterns." That night, as rain traced gentle lines down the window panes, Holmes played his violin once more. The melody was slow and contemplative, each note allowed to linger before giving way to the next. The music filled the room without urgency, settling the mind rather than stimulating it. I found myself reflecting upon the figure of Stapleton, not with anger, but with a detached curiosity. "He believed himself patient," I said aloud, almost without intention. Holmes paused in his playing. He was patient, but patience without perspective becomes obsession, and obsession, I added, narrows the world. Exactly, Holmes said, resuming the melody. The more widened ours, it narrowed his. Beats passed gently. Clients came and went, some satisfied, others merely reassured, and Bokefberg, Myvhara Pisberg. Even when solutions were incomplete, Holmes provided something equally valuable: clarity. One afternoon, as sunlight filtered softly into the sitting room, Holmes leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes. "Watson," he said, "do you know why the hound lingered in a mind?" "Because it was unseen," I replied. "Yes," he said, "and because it arrived at night. The mind fills darkness with invention." He opened his eyes. "Light," he added, "is not merely illumination. It is understanding." That evening, as I prepared for bed, I reviewed my notes once more. The case had long since resolved, yet its details continued to settle, arranging themselves into something more than mere chronology. They formed a lesson. Fear thrives in uncertainty. Calm reveals proportion. I extinguished the lamp and lay down, listening to the steady rhythm of the city beyond the walls. Somewhere a carriage passed. A door closed softly. Life continued, indifferent and reassuring. Sleep came easily, and in that sleep there was no hound, no cry upon the moor, only open land beneath, a quiet sky, and the slow, steady understanding that some mysteries are solved. As the season turned, London seemed to slow its pace, not in haste or fatigue, but in quiet agreement with the lengthening days. Twilight lingered longer at the windows of Baker Street, softening the outlines of buildings and easing the mind into a gentler rhythm. It was during these evenings that Holmes appeared most at ease. He would sit by the window with a book resting unopened upon his knee, gazing not at the page, but at the slow changes of light outside. From time to time, a sound from the street would draw his attention, a voice, a footstep, the distant clatter of wheels, and he would note it without comment, as one acknowledges a passing cloud. One such evening, as the city settled into its nocturnal calm, I joined him. "You are unusually still," I remarked. Holmes smiled faintly. "Stillness," he replied, "is often mistaken for idleness. In truth, it is preparation." "For what?" I asked. "For the understanding that arrives only when one ceases to pursue it." We sat together in silence for some time. The ticking of the clock marked the passing minutes, yet it felt less like measurement and more like accompaniment, a steady reminder that time itself required no guidance. I found my thoughts drifting again to Devonshire, not to the moments of fear or urgency, but to the spaces between them. The long walks, the pauses before speech, the nights when the moor lay quiet and expansive beneath the stars. "It is strange," I said at last, "how the mind returns not to danger, but to calm." Holmes nodded. "Danger is immediate, calm is instructive." That night I dreamed of walking across open land beneath a wide sky. There was no destination, no urgency, only movement, measured and unforced. When I woke, the sense of ease remained with me. The following days unfolded gently. Holmes accepted a small number of cases, each requiring little more than observation and patience. He resolved them quietly, without drama, and often without leaving the sitting room. One client in particular lingered in my thoughts, a man convinced he was followed, watched at every turn. Holmes listened without interruption, then asked a single question. "Have you noticed," he said, "how rarely your fear is confirmed?" The man hesitated, then shook his head. "Fear," Holmes continued, "is not evidence, it is anticipation. The man departed calmer than he arrived, leaving behind not certainty, but space. At evening, Holmes spoke again of the moor. "It is a place," he said, "where the land itself encourages reflection. Horizon offers no boundary, and so the mind learns to expand. And yet," I replied, "it also conceals." "Yes," Holmes said, "expansion and concealment are not opposites, they coexist." He reached for his violin and began to play. The melody was slower than usual, each note unfolding gently, as though reluctant to disturb the quiet. I listened without analysis, allowing the sound to settle where it would. As the music faded, Holmes set the instrument aside. "Watson," he said, "have you ever considered why certain cases remain with us long after they are resolved?" "I have," I replied. "They change us." "Precisely," Holmes said. "And change need not be dramatic to be profound." I thought of Sir Henry, walking his land without fear, of the villagers, resuming their lives with cautious optimism, of the Hall, no longer waiting. Change, I realized, often arrived not with announcement, but with acceptance. Weeks passed. The city bloomed fully in spring, and with it came a lightness that seemed to lift even the heaviest thoughts. Holmes spent more time walking, returning with observations that were less about people and more about patterns, the way light moved across a street, the rhythm of footsteps at different hours, the subtle shifts that marked the passage of days. One afternoon, as we sat together after a long walk, Holmes spoke quietly. "The mind," he said, "requires intervals of rest, just as the body does. Without them, it begins to invent problems." "And with them?" I asked. "With them," he replied, "it learns to recognize what truly matters." That night, I wrote in my journal longer than usual, not of crimes or deductions, but of impressions, the feel of air after rain, the sound of music at dusk, the steady reassurance of routine. I extinguished the lamp and lay down, listening to the soft sounds of the house settling round me. The city outside moved gently, its noise distant and subdued. Sleep came slowly, like a tide rising without urgency. In the half-dream that followed, I stood once more upon the moor. The land was quiet, the sky vast. There was no cry, no movement beyond the ordinary, only the steady presence of the world as it was. And in that presence, I felt no need to search. There are moments in life when nothing demands attention, when the mind is not pulled forward by urgency, nor backward by memory. Such moments are easily overlooked, yet they possess a quiet power. It was into this space that our days at Baker Street now settled. Holmes seemed content to let time pass without interference. He read slowly, returning to passages not for information, but for cadence, for the rhythm of language itself. At times he would pause mid-page, gaze drifting toward the window, and remain so for several minutes, as though listening for something that did not announce itself. I had learned not to interrupt him during these intervals. One afternoon, as the light softened and the street below fell into its familiar hum, Holmes spoke without turning his head. "Watson," he said, "have you noticed how seldom we allow ourselves to be unoccupied?" "Yes," I replied. "We tend to fill every space. And yet," he continued, "it is in those spaces that understanding settles." He closed the book and set it aside. "The case of Baskerville," he said quietly, "could not have been solved through action alone. It required waiting, allowing the truth to reveal itself rather than forcing it into view." I thought of the nights he had spent hidden upon the moor, observing without movement, allowing fear to expose its own machinery. "That is not easy," I said. "No," Holmes agreed. but it is necessary. That evening, we walked once more through the quieter streets of London. The city had begun to glow with the soft illumination of early lamps, their light reflected faintly upon damp stone. There was a sense of enclosure here, yet not confinement, rather a gentle holding, as one is held by a familiar room. Holmes walked without haste, his stride measured, his attention broad rather than focused. He spoke occasionally, but only when words felt essential. London, he remarked at one point, is not unlike the Moor. I raised an eyebrow. In what way? It conceals as much as it reveals, he said. The difference lies only in scale. We paused at a crossing, allowing a carriage to pass. The sound of its wheels faded gradually, swallowed a distance. Fear, Holmes continued, is universal. It does not belong to landscapes, but to interpretation. And calm? I asked. Calm, he replied, belongs to acceptance. The following days unfolded gently. Holmes declined more invitations than he accepted, and when he did agree to meet a client, the conversations were brief, often concluding with reassurance rather than resolution. It seemed that many who sought him desired not answers, but confirmation that their worries were survivable. One man, pale and anxious, spoke of a presence he felt in his home, footsteps where there were none, shadows that lingered too long. Holmes listened, then asked softly, "When did you last rest?" The man hesitated. "I cannot remember." "Then begin there," Holmes said. The man left calmer, and he arrived. That night, Holmes played his violin once more. The melody was sparse, each note separated by silence. It did not demand attention, yet it shaped the room, lending the air a sense of continuity. I lay back in my chair and allowed the sound to pass through me, neither analyzing nor anticipating it. When the music ended, the silence that followed felt complete rather than empty. Later, as we prepared to retire, Holmes spoke again. "Watson," he said, "there is a tendency to believe that closure requires explanation." "And does it not?" I asked. "Sometimes," he replied, "but often closure arrives and the mind releases its grip." I considered this as I lay in bed, listening to the quiet of the house. The city outside murmured softly, its rhythm steady and reassuring. Sleep came, without resistance. In my dreams, I walked again across open land, though it was no longer the moor alone. Fields and streets blended seamlessly, horizons widening and narrowing without conflict. There was no threat, no pursuit, only movement, unhurried and unexamined. When I woke, the sense of ease remained. Morning brought with it a soft rain, barely audible against the windows. Holmes was already awake, seated by the table with a cup of tea, his posture relaxed. "You slept well," he observed. "Yes," I replied. "Without dreams." Holmes smiled faintly. "Then the mind has found its balance." As the day progressed, I found myself less inclined to revisit the details of past cases. They seemed settled, complete. What remained was not narrative, but impression. A deeper understanding of how easily fear could take shape, and how gently it could dissolve when no longer fed. That afternoon, I stood once more at the window, watching the street below. A child laughed as he ran past, his sound brief but bright. Somewhere, a door closed softly. Life continued, unburdened by the weight we so often assign it. Holmes joined me. "The world," he said, "is wider than any single story we tell about it." "And quieter," I added. "Yes," he replied, "if one allows it to be." As evening approached, the light faded slowly, drawing the room into shadow without darkness. The lamps were lighted, casting a warm glow that felt neither intrusive nor insistent. We sat together without speaking, the comfort of shared silence settling around us. And in that silence I sensed that the long echo of the moor, its lessons, its vastness, its quiet endurance, had fully found its place within us, no longer as memory, but as understanding. There is a particular quality to evenings when nothing presses for attention, the hours do not announce themselves, and the mind, freed from urgency, drifts naturally toward rest. Such evenings had become frequent at Baker Street, as though the house itself had learned to settle. On this night the lamps were lit early, their glow warm and steady. Outside, the street lay quiet beneath a thin veil of mist, the sound of distant movement softened to a low murmur. Holmes sat in his accustomed chair, hands folded loosely, his gaze resting not upon any object in particular, but upon the space between things. I occupied myself with a book, though I found myself turning pages without absorbing their meaning. It was not distraction that claimed my attention, but ease, the rare permission to let thought wander without destination. Holmes spoke at last, his voice low. "Watson," he said, "do you recall the first night we arrived at Baskerville Hall?" "Yes," I replied. The silence was heavy. "And now?" he asked. I considered this. Now, silence feels different. It no longer demands explanation. Holmes nodded. That is the distinction most people never learn. He rose and crossed the room, pausing briefly by the window. The mist outside thickened, blurring the outlines of buildings and lamps alike. "Fog," he said, "is not concealment, it is transition." I smiled faintly. "You find metaphor everywhere." "No," he replied, "I find pattern." We returned to our chairs and allowed the evening to continue without interference. Time passed gently. The clock marked the hours, but its ticking felt less like measurement and more like accompaniment, a quiet reminder that movement need not be hurried, be real. Later, Holmes reached for his violin. He did not tune it, he did not prepare, he simply lifted it and began to play. The melody was slow, sparse, and restrained. Notes merged one by one, each given room to breathe before the next followed. There was no urgency in the sound, no expectation of resolution. It unfolded as the evening itself did, naturally, without insistence. I closed my eyes and listened. As the music continued, my thoughts drifted, not backward into memory, nor forward into anticipation, but outward, expanding gently. I thought of open land beneath wide skies, of roads stretching without demand, of nights where darkness did not threaten, but held. When the music ended, the silence that followed felt complete. Holmes set the violin aside. "Music," he said quietly, "is one of the few things that does not require interpretation to be understood." I nodded. "It allows the mind to rest." "Yes," he agreed. "And rest is not absence. It is integration." The word lingered with me. Integration. It described precisely what I felt, the gradual settling of experiences into something cohesive, something whole. The moor, the hound, the fear, the resolution, all had found their places, no longer demanding attention. That night, sleep came quickly. I dreamed not in images, but in sensation, a sense of space, of quiet movement, of continuity, without direction. When I woke briefly in the night, the house was silent, the city beyond subdued. I felt no urge to rise, no curiosity to investigate. Morning arrived without drama. Light filtered softly into the room, pale and unassertive. Holmes was already awake, seated at the table with a cup of tea, his expression calm. "You slept well," he observed. "Yes," I replied, deeply. Holmes smiled faintly. Then the night served its purpose. The day that followed was unremarkable, and for that very reason, satisfying. Holmes read. I attended to my notes. The house remained quiet, its rhythms familiar and reassuring. At midday, a light rain began to fall, tapping gently against the windows. The sound was even and consistent, neither intrusive nor insistent. It seemed to invite stillness. Holmes looked up from his book. Rain, he said, has a way of smoothing thought. I agreed. That afternoon we spoke little. Words felt necessary. When we did speak, it was only to acknowledge small things, a change in light, a sound from the street, the passage of time. As evening approached once more, I felt a growing sense of completion, not an ending, but a fullness. The story that had begun upon the moor had not concluded with a single act or revelation, but had dissolved gradually into understanding. That, I realized, was its true resolution. Holmes joined me by the window as dusk settled. The mind, he said softly, is like a landscape. Left alone, it organizes itself. And if disturbed, I asked. It adapts, he replied. But it always seeks equilibrium. The lamps were lit once more. The room took on its familiar warmth. Outside, the mist deepened, turning the city into a series of gentle impressions rather than defined shapes. I prepared for bed with unhurried movements, feeling no need to rush the night. As I lay down, the sounds of the house faded gradually, the settling of wood, the distant murmur of the street, the soft passage of time. Sleep arrived like a tide, slow, steady, inevitable. And as it did, there was no fear, no pursuit, no unanswered question, only the quiet certainty that everything necessary had already found its place. There comes a time when even memory grows quiet, not erased, not forgotten, simply settled, like dust after long movement. It was into this state that my thoughts now drifted with increasing ease. Baker Street had become once more a place of gentle routine, its walls holding familiarity rather than anticipation. Holmes moved through the days with an unhurried grace. His presence, once defined by intensity and sharp focus, now carried a broader calm. When he spoke, it was with economy. When he listened, it was without expectation. I realized then that this, too, was part of his discipline. One evening, as twilight stretched thinly across the room, I found Holmes standing near the window, his silhouette softened by the fading light. The day is complete, he said quietly, as though remarking on something beyond the ordinary measure of time. Yes, I replied, it feels that way. We stood together without speaking, watching as the street lamps flickered on one by one. Their glow did not pierce the dusk so much as blend with it, creating pools of warmth along the pavement. Holmes turned slightly. Do you know, he asked, why the final moments of a case are so often overlooked? Because the excitement is past, I suggested. Because resolution lacks spectacle, he replied. And yet, it is the most instructive phase. I considered this. In resolution, he continued, there is nothing left to pursue. One must sit with what remains. And what remains? I asked. Holmes smiled faintly, understanding. The words settled between us, unchallenged. That night, I slept without interruption. There were no dreams that lingered, no images that demanded interpretation, only a gentle continuity, as though the mind had decided to rest without commentary. Morning arrived quietly. Holmes was already awake, reading near the window, the pale light of early day outlining his features. Good morning, he said softly. Good morning, I replied. Neither of us felt compelled to say more. The hours passed without distinction. I attended to my notes. Holmes read, occasionally pausing to gaze outward. The house itself seemed attuned to our pace, its familiar creaks and murmurs offering reassurance rather than distraction. At midday, a light breeze stirred the curtains. The air felt fresh, renewed. Holmes closed his book. "Watson," he said, "have you noticed how rarely the mind is given permission to stop?" "Yes," I replied. "It is always urged onward." "And yet," he continued, "it resolves most naturally when allowed to be still." We spoke little after that. Words felt unnecessary, even intrusive. The quiet that filled the room was complete, neither empty or tense. Later I found myself reflecting upon the moor once more, not as a place of events, but as a presence. Its vastness had offered perspective. Its silence demanded honesty. Now that same perspective found its way into everyday life. The world felt wider. That evening, Holmes played his violin again, not with intention, but with ease. The notes drifted softly, forming no recognizable melody, only a sequence of sounds that rose and fell gently, like breath. I listened without thought, allowing the sound to pass through me. When the music ended, Holmes remained still for a moment longer, then set the instrument aside. "Completion," he said quietly, "is not an ending." "No," I agreed. "It is a resting place." He nodded. Night fell slowly. The city beyond our windows softened into shadow, its sounds subdued. The lamps cast a familiar glow, steady and warm. As I prepared for bed, I felt no urgency, no expectation of tomorrow, only the sense that this moment, exactly as it was, required nothing more. Lying down, I listened to the house settle around me. Somewhere below, Holmes moved quietly, his presence a constant, reassuring fact. Sleep approached without resistance. In the quiet before it claimed me, I sensed the final loosening of tension, the release of all that had once demanded explanation. There was no mystery left to solve, only the gentle continuity of time, moving forward without insistence, and within that movement, a deep and abiding calm. There is a moment, just before sleep fully claims the mind, when all effort releases its hold, thoughts loosen, memory softens. The distinction between past and present grows faint. It was into this moment that the long story of the Moor finally settled. Porker Street lay quiet, not silent in the absolute sense, but alive in a gentle, reassuring way. The muted sounds of the city moving at a respectful distance, the slow breathing of the house, the familiar presence of walls that had witnessed both urgency and repose. Holmes was awake when I passed through the sitting room, though he made no sign of it at first. He sat in his chair near the window, hands resting loosely, his gaze unfocused. The violin lay nearby, untouched. "You are not sleeping," I observed softly. "Not yet," he replied. "The day has not quite finished with me." I joined him without further question. There was no need to fill the space between us with conversation. Some evenings, silence was not merely appropriate, it was complete. Outside, the street lamps glowed steadily, their light diffused by a thin veil of mist. The world beyond seemed softened, reduced to suggestion rather than detail. It felt distant, but not removed. Holmes spoke at last. "Watson," he said, "do you recall the feeling of the moor at night?" "Yes," I replied. "It felt endless." "And now?" he asked. I considered this. "Now it feels contained, not diminished, simply understood." Holmes smiled faintly. "That is the nature of fear. Once understood, it no longer needs to announce itself." We sat together a little longer, watching as the mist shifted gently, reshaping the world without effort. The clock marked the hour, but even its ticking seemed unimportant. a background rhythm rather than a command. Eventually, Holmes rose. "The mind," he said quietly, "must be allowed to close its own doors." I nodded. As I prepared for bed, I felt no impulse to revisit the details of the case, no need to retrace events or test conclusions. Everything that needed to be known had already found its place. I lay down, the sheets cool and familiar, the room dim but welcoming, the house settled around me, each sound arriving softly and departing just as gently. Sleep approached, not as an interruption, but as a continuation. In the final moments before consciousness faded, images drifted through my mind, not sharply, not insistently. Open land beneath a wide sky, a path stretching without urgency, horizon neither approaching nor retreating. There was no hound, no cry, no pursuit, only space. The moor, once place of tension and legend, now existed as something quieter, a reminder rather than a threat. It had offered perspective, then stepped back, allowing life to resume its natural rhythm. Somewhere, far from fear and effort, Sir Henry walked his land in peace. The hall stood not as a monument to the past, but as a living place, shaped by presence rather than absence. And here in London, the world continued as it always had, not hurried, not delayed, simply moving. The breath slowed, thought dissolved, awareness softened. There was nothing left to solve, nothing left to pursue, only rest. And as sleep finally closed around me, it did so without ceremony, gently, completely, like the quiet settling of night over a world that had learned, at last, how to be still.